You keep telling yourself that tomorrow will be different, that tomorrow you will wake up earlier, be more focused, more disciplined, more in control. But tomorrow keeps turning into the same version of today. And deep down, you already know the truth you've been avoiding. You are not stuck because life is unfair. You are not stuck because you lack talent. You are stuck because you keep negotiating with your own weakness, and every time you do, you lose a small piece of yourself. There is a moment that happens quietly, almost invisibly. The alarm goes off. Your mind wakes up before your body does, and in that tiny space between awareness and action, a voice appears. It doesn't scream, it doesn't force, it whispers, "Just 5 more minutes. You deserve it. You'll start later." And in that moment, something far more important than sleep is being decided. Not your schedule, not your productivity, but your identity. Because every time you listen to that voice, you are not just choosing comfort, you are reinforcing a pattern. You are teaching your brain that your words mean nothing, that your intentions are optional, that discipline is something you will always delay. And over time, this becomes who you are, not because you chose it consciously, but because you repeated it unconsciously. A man named Daniel once believed he had a motivation problem. He bought books, watched videos, wrote goals on paper. Every Sunday night he felt powerful. Every Monday morning he felt defeated. The cycle repeated so many times that he stopped trusting himself. And that is where the real damage began, not in his failures, but in the silent belief that he could no longer rely on his own decisions. But here is what most people never realize. The problem is not that you fail. The problem is that you fail in the same way, for the same reasons, without ever questioning the pattern. You think you need more inspiration, but what you actually need is confrontation. A confrontation with the version of yourself that keeps choosing what is easy over what is necessary. And here is the uncomfortable truth. You don't become unstoppable by doing extraordinary things. You become unstoppable by refusing to break the smallest promises you make to yourself. Not once, not occasionally, but every single time. Now pause for a moment and really look at your life. Not the big goals, not the dreams you talk about. Look at the small decisions you repeat every day, because that is where your future is being built. Quietly, consistently, without asking for your permission. And here is where everything begins to change. The next 7 days are not about becoming a different person. They are about proving to yourself that you can trust your own actions again, not through motivation, not through hype, but through simple habits that force you to confront your weakness instead of escaping it. But before we go any further, there is something you need to understand. What you are about to do is not comfortable. It is not exciting. And it will not feel powerful in the beginning. In fact, it will feel almost meaningless, and that is exactly why it works. Because discipline is built in the moments that feel too small to matter. And once you understand that, you stop chasing big changes. You start controlling small ones. And that is where becoming unstoppable truly begins. There is a silent habit that is quietly destroying your life, and the most dangerous part is you don't even notice it happening. It's not procrastination in the way people usually describe it. It's not the big, obvious delays. It's something much smaller, much more subtle. It's what I call micro-avoidance. Those tiny decisions where you choose what is slightly easier instead of what is slightly harder. And because they seem harmless, you allow them to repeat. You open your phone before starting your work, just for a minute. You delay a task because you don't feel ready yet. You tell yourself you'll begin after one more video, one more scroll, one more quick break, and each time it feels insignificant, almost justified. But here is what is actually happening beneath the surface. Every time you avoid a small discomfort, your brain registers it as relief. And relief is addictive. Not pleasure, not success, relief. The removal of pressure becomes the reward, and slowly, without realizing it, you begin to train yourself to escape instead of engage. A woman named Claire used to struggle with this in a way that looked completely normal from the outside. She had a stable job, clear goals, and enough intelligence to succeed. But every time she sat down to do meaningful work, she felt an invisible resistance. So she would prepare, she would organize her desk, check emails, adjust her plan, and by the end of the day, she felt exhausted, without having done anything that actually mattered. Now here is where it becomes dangerous, because your mind is incredibly good at lying to you in a polite way. It doesn't say you're avoiding your responsibilities. It says you're getting ready. It doesn't say you're afraid of discomfort. It says you just need the right mood. And over time, you begin to believe these lies because they sound reasonable. But if you step back and observe the pattern, something becomes clear. You are not preparing. You are postponing. And the longer you repeat this cycle, the weaker your ability to act becomes. Not because you lack strength, but because you are constantly teaching your brain that action is optional and avoidance is safe. Now let me show you something most people never see. Imagine two versions of your day. In the first version, you delay starting your work by 10 minutes, then another 10, then another. It doesn't feel like much. But by the end of the day, you've lost hours. In the second version, you start immediately, even if it feels uncomfortable. No delay, no negotiation. The difference between these 2 days is not time. It is identity. One version of you acts based on feelings. The other acts based on decisions. And this is where the shift begins. Because becoming unstoppable is not about doing more. It is about removing the space between knowing and doing. It is about collapsing that gap until action becomes immediate. But here is the part that most people resist. You don't fix this by forcing yourself to be perfect. You fix this by interrupting the pattern at its smallest point. Not when you've already wasted hours, but in the first 5 seconds of hesitation. The moment you feel the urge to delay, that is the exact moment you must act. Not later, not when you feel ready, right there. This is the first habit. Act before your mind has time to negotiate. It sounds simple, almost too simple, but that is exactly why it is powerful. Because your mind is incredibly persuasive when given time, but it is weak when faced with immediate action. Claire didn't change her life overnight. She didn't suddenly become highly motivated or inspired. She made one small decision. Every time she noticed herself preparing, she would stop and begin the task immediately, even if it felt messy, incomplete, or uncomfortable. And at first, it felt unnatural, forced, almost wrong. But after a few days, something shifted. She stopped trusting her excuses and started trusting her actions. Now pause here for a moment, because what I'm about to say might change how you see your entire life. You don't lack discipline because you are weak. You lack discipline because you have practiced hesitation more than action. And whatever you practice, you become. So the question is no longer, how do I become motivated? The real question is, what are you repeatedly allowing yourself to avoid? Because that is exactly where your transformation is hiding. And once you start seeing it, you can no longer unsee it. Most people think change begins with doing more effort, more discipline, more control. But what they don't realize is that real change begins much earlier at the level of identity. You don't fail because you don't know what to do. You fail because at a deeper level, you don't see yourself as the kind of person who follows through. And until that changes, no habit will last. No plan will survive, because every action you take is filtered through one invisible question your mind keeps asking. Is this who I am? A man named Eric struggled with this for years. He tried waking up early, working out, building routines, and every time he lasted a few days before falling back. He thought he lacked discipline, but the truth was something much more subtle. Every time he tried to act differently, there was a quiet resistance inside him. Not loud, not obvious, just a feeling that this wasn't him. So even when he forced himself to act, it felt temporary, like he was pretending to be someone else. And that is exactly why it never lasted. Because behavior that conflicts with identity always collapses under pressure. Now here is where most people go wrong. They try to change their schedule before they change their self-image. They say, "From tomorrow, I will wake up at 5 a.m." But deep down, they still see themselves as someone who struggles to wake up. They say, "I will be disciplined." But internally, they still identify as someone inconsistent. And this creates a silent conflict. Your actions move in one direction. Your identity pulls you back in another. And identity always wins. So instead of forcing new actions, you need to start with something much simpler and much more powerful. You need to reset how you see yourself. This is where the next habit begins, not with what you do, but with what you declare. Step 1, you choose one identity, not 5, not 10, one, something simple, something specific. Not, "I want to be successful," but "I am someone who does what I said I would do." Now this might sound like a small shift, almost insignificant, but stay with me, because once you define this identity, everything changes. Step 2, you prove it with the smallest possible action. Not a big goal, not a complete transformation, just one action that aligns with that identity. If your identity is someone who keeps promises, then your job is not to change your entire life overnight. Your job is to keep one promise today, just one. Eric started with something almost laughably small. He told himself he would wake up and immediately drink a glass of water. That was it. No workouts, no long routines, just one action. And for the first time, he followed through. Now here is the part most people overlook. It wasn't the action that mattered. It was the evidence. Because in that moment, Eric was no longer trying to become disciplined. He had proof that he already was, in a small way. And that changes how your brain works. Because your mind builds identity based on evidence, not intention. You can tell yourself you are disciplined all day long, but if your actions don't support it, your brain rejects it. But the moment you create even a small piece of evidence, something shifts internally. You start to believe it. And once belief begins, behavior follows. Now step 3, you repeat it. Not perfectly, not intensely, but consistently. Because identity is not built in one moment. It is built through repeated proof. And every time you act in alignment with that identity, you strengthen it. You make it more real, more stable. But let me be clear about something. This is not exciting. It doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It feels almost boring. And that is exactly why most people quit here. They are addicted to big changes. But identity is built through small confirmations. Eric didn't suddenly transform his entire life in 2 days. But after a week of keeping that one small promise, he noticed something different. He started trusting himself again. And that trust made it easier to take on slightly bigger actions. Not because he forced himself, but because it felt natural. Now pause here for a moment and look at your own life. How many times have you tried to change your behavior without ever changing how you see yourself? How many times have you made promises that your own mind didn't believe? Because this is where everything either breaks or begins. You don't need a new plan. You need a new identity, backed by evidence. And once that foundation is built, discipline is no longer something you chase. It becomes something you express. And this is only the beginning. Because in the next part, you are going to face something even harder. Not your habits, but your emotions. There is a version of you that only shows up when you feel good, motivated, clear, ready. And then there is another version of you. The one that shows up when you're tired, distracted, irritated, or simply not in the mood. Most people build their lives around the first version, but their future is always decided by the second. You wake up, and for once, you feel energized. You follow your plan, you do what needs to be done, and in those moments you start believing that you've finally figured it out. That this is the new you. But then, a few days later, something shifts. You feel heavy, unfocused. Your mind starts pushing back, and suddenly, everything that felt easy becomes difficult again. And this is where most people fall apart. because they believe that discipline should feel natural. But it doesn't. A man named Lucas used to think that once he fixed his mindset, everything would become easier. He believed that successful people had some kind of internal clarity that made discipline effortless. But every time he tried to stay consistent, he ran into the same wall. The moment he didn't feel like doing something, he stopped. At first, he blamed motivation. Then he blamed his environment. Eventually, he blamed himself. But the real problem was something he had never questioned. He was obeying his emotions. Now pause here, because this is where things become uncomfortable. Your emotions are not designed to help you succeed. They are designed to keep you comfortable. And comfort is the exact opposite of growth. You feel like resting. Your brain is trying to conserve energy. You feel like avoiding a task. Your brain is trying to protect you from discomfort. You feel like waiting for the right moment. Your brain is trying to delay effort. None of these are aligned with the life you say you want. And yet you listen to them, not because you are weak, but because you've never been trained to question them. This is where the internal conflict begins. Your mind says, I don't feel like it today. Your future says, do it anyway. And in that moment, one of them wins. Now imagine this as a conversation happening inside you. Your emotional mind speaks first. I'm tired, let's just skip today. Your rational mind responds. But we said we would do this. Your emotional mind pushes back. It's just one day, it won't matter. And here is where most people lose. Because they negotiate. Okay, just this once. But it is never just once. It becomes a pattern. Lucas lived in this cycle for years, until one day something shifted. Not because he found new motivation, but because he got tired of arguing with himself. He realized something simple. Every time he negotiated with his emotions, he lost. So he made a decision that felt almost extreme. He removed the negotiation entirely. If he said he would do something, he did it. No discussion, no debate, no adjustment based on mood. At first, it felt brutal, unnatural, almost robotic. But something unexpected happened. The voice in his head started getting quieter. Not because it disappeared, but because it stopped being heard. Now think about that for a moment. Your emotions don't control you. Your attention does. The more you listen to that voice, the louder it becomes. The more you ignore it, the weaker it gets. And this leads to the third habit. Do what you said you would do, regardless of how you feel. Not when you're ready, not when it's convenient, not when it's comfortable, but especially when it's not. Because that is the moment that actually matters. Now let me show you something deeper. When you act despite resistance, you are not just completing a task. You are rewriting your internal hierarchy. You are teaching your mind that feelings are temporary, but decisions are final. And once that shift happens, everything changes. You stop asking, do I feel like doing this? And you start asking, did I say I would do this? That one question removes confusion. It removes hesitation. It removes weakness. But here is the part most people don't expect. It will feel harder before it feels easier, because you are breaking a pattern that has been reinforced for years. Your mind will resist. It will try to pull you back. It will give you better excuses than ever before. And that is how you know it's working. Because resistance is not a sign you should stop. It is a sign you are finally doing something different. So the next time you feel that internal pushback, don't try to eliminate it. Don't try to fix it. Just act anyway. Because discipline is not built in the absence of resistance. It is built in spite of it. And once you learn that, you stop being controlled by how you feel. You start becoming someone who decides and follows through. And in the next part, you're going to see something even more subtle. Something that has been controlling your behavior this entire time without you even realizing it. There is something shaping your life right now that you rarely question. It is not your willpower. It is not your motivation. It is your environment. And the most dangerous part is, it doesn't feel like control. It feels normal. Imagine this. You wake up in the morning, your phone is next to your bed, You don't think about it, you just reach for it. Notifications, messages, a quick scroll, nothing extreme, nothing harmful, just a small action that feels automatic. But that action was never a decision. It was a response. Now follow this pattern a little further. You sit down to work. Your desk is cluttered. Your browser already has distractions open. Your mind feels scattered before you even begin. You try to focus, but something keeps pulling you away. Not strongly, just enough. And by the end of the day, you feel like you lacked discipline. But what if the truth is, you never had a fair chance to begin with? A man named Ryan once believed he had a focus problem. He couldn't stay consistent. He blamed himself constantly, thought he was weak, undisciplined. But one day, something small happened that changed everything. He went to a quiet place to work. No noise, no phone, no interruptions. And for the first time in months, he focused. Not because he became stronger, but because the environment stopped pulling him apart. Now pause here for a moment, because this is where most people misunderstand discipline. They think discipline means resisting temptation. But real discipline is removing temptation before it appears. Let's go deeper. Your brain is constantly scanning for what is easy, familiar, and rewarding. It doesn't want to struggle. It doesn't want friction. So it looks around your environment and asks one simple question. What here requires the least effort right now? If your phone is within reach, that becomes the answer. If distractions are visible, that becomes the answer. If comfort is easier than effort, that becomes the answer. And over time, your behavior adapts to your surroundings, not your intentions. This is why you can feel like two completely different people, depending on where you are. In one environment, you are focused, sharp, disciplined. In another, you are distracted, slow, reactive. Same person, different inputs. And this leads to the fourth habit. Control your environment, or it will control you. Now let me show you what this actually looks like in real life. Ryan didn't try to become more disciplined. He changed his setup. He removed social media from his phone. He placed his phone in another room while working. He cleared his desk so that only one task was visible. He created friction for distractions and removed friction for action. At first, it felt unnecessary, almost extreme. But something unexpected happened. He stopped needing willpower because the things that used to distract him were no longer there. Now here's where it gets deeper. Environment doesn't just affect your actions. It affects your thoughts. When you are surrounded by distractions, your mind becomes fragmented. When you are surrounded by clarity, your mind becomes focused. You don't rise to your goals. You fall to your environment. And most people are trying to fight a battle they've already lost, simply because they refuse to change the battlefield. But before you go further, there is something you need to really understand. Changing your environment is not about perfection. It's about direction. You don't need to eliminate every distraction. You just need to make the right actions easier than the wrong ones. Because when that balance shifts, behavior follows naturally. Now ask yourself this. What in your current environment is silently working against you? What is always within reach that pulls you away from what matters? And more importantly, what would happen if you removed it just for a few days? Because the version of you that you are trying to become might not need more discipline. They might just need a different environment. And in the next part, you're going to see something even more powerful. Not a system. Not a strategy, but a single action that can rebuild your trust in yourself from the ground up. There is a moment in your life that doesn't look important. No applause, no recognition, no visible progress. Just a small promise and a quiet decision. And yet, that moment has the power to rebuild something you didn't even realize you lost. Your self-trust. A woman named Elena once reached a point where she stopped setting goals altogether. Not because she didn't want more from life, but because she no longer believed herself when she made promises. Every time she said, "I'll start tomorrow," a part of her mind would respond instantly, "No, you won't." And that voice was right, not because she was incapable, but because she had trained herself to break her own word so many times that her mind adapted. Now here is what most people don't understand. Confidence is not built by success. It is built by consistency. And consistency is nothing more than keeping the promises you make to yourself, especially when no one is watching. But when you repeatedly fail to follow through, something deeper happens. You stop trusting your intentions. You stop believing your plans. And eventually, you stop trying. Because why would you commit to something that you already expect yourself to abandon? This is where everything begins to collapse. Not in your results, but in your relationship with yourself. Now pause here for a moment, because what I'm about to say is simple, but it carries more weight than it seems. You don't need to fix your entire life. You need to keep one promise. Just one. Not 10 habits, not a full routine, not a complete transformation. One promise that you will not break. This is the 5th habit. Keep one promise, no matter what. Now let's go deeper. Elena didn't try to rebuild everything at once. She didn't create a long list of goals. She chose one action, something small, something almost too easy to ignore. Every day, at the same time, she would take a 10-minute walk. That was it. No conditions, no excuses, no negotiation. Rain or shine, busy or tired, motivated or not, she made the promise and she kept it. Now at first, it didn't feel powerful. It didn't feel life-changing. It felt small, almost meaningless. But after a few days, something began to shift. That voice in her head, the one that used to say you won't follow through, started to hesitate. Because now there was evidence, and that changes everything. Because your mind doesn't operate on hope. It operates on proof. And every time you keep a promise, you create proof. Proof that you are reliable. Proof that your words matter. Proof that you can be trusted by yourself. Now here is where it becomes powerful. Once that trust begins to rebuild, your capacity expands. Not because you forced it, but because it feels safe. It feels real. Elena didn't stay at one habit forever, but she didn't rush either. After she built trust with that one promise, she added another, slowly, intentionally. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was chasing change. She felt like she was becoming someone consistent. Now think about your own life. How many promises have you made and broken? How many times have you said, "This time will be different," without any real proof? Because this is where most people lose before they even begin. They try to build a new life on a foundation of broken trust, and no system, no strategy, no motivation can survive that. But one kept promise? That is where everything begins, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and permanently. So here is the challenge. Choose one promise. Make it small enough that you cannot justify breaking it, and then keep it, no matter what. Because you are not just completing a task, you are rebuilding your identity. And once that foundation is strong, everything else becomes possible. And in the next part, you are going to confront something most people avoid their entire lives. Not failure, not difficulty, but the illusion of balance that is quietly keeping you average. There is a belief that sounds healthy, but quietly destroys your potential. Balance is everything. You hear it everywhere. Work-life balance, emotional balance, taking it easy, not pushing too hard. And on the surface, it feels right. It feels wise. It feels sustainable. But here is the truth most people never confront. Balance, as most people practice it, is just a socially acceptable form of avoidance. A man named Victor once built his life around this idea. He worked, but not too hard, rested, but not too much, pushed himself, but only when he felt ready. From the outside, everything looked stable, calm, controlled. But inside, something was off. Years passed, and nothing changed. Not because he lacked opportunity, but because he never allowed himself to fully commit. Now pause here for a moment, because this is where things become uncomfortable. You cannot become unstoppable while protecting your comfort at the same time. At some point, you have to choose growth or ease, progress, or balance. Because the version of you that stays balanced is the same version that stays where they are. Now let's break this illusion. Most people use balance as a way to justify inconsistency. I worked hard today, so I deserve to slack tomorrow. I pushed myself this week, so I'll take it easy next week. I'm tired, so I'll skip this just once. But look closely. That is not balance. That is negotiation. And every time you negotiate with your standards, they get lower. Victor lived in this cycle for years, until one day something shifted, not because of motivation, not because of inspiration, but because of frustration. He realized that his version of balance was keeping him stuck. So he made a decision that felt extreme. He stopped negotiating. Not forever, but for a period of time. 7 days. 7 days where he removed the idea of balance completely. If something needed to be done, he did it. If it was uncomfortable, even better. If he didn't feel like it, that was the signal to act. And what happened in those 7 days changed everything. Not because his life transformed overnight, but because his standards did. Now let me show you something deeper. There is a version of you that operates based on convenience, and there is a version of you that operates based on commitment. These two cannot coexist, because one waits for the right moment, the other creates it. And this leads to the 6th shift. Stop trying to live a balanced life and start building a committed one. Now understand this clearly. This is not about burning yourself out. This is not about ignoring your health or your limits. This is about removing the constant negotiation that weakens your discipline. Because every time you ask yourself, should I do this or not, you create space for doubt. But when the answer is already decided, there is no conflict. There is only action. Victor didn't destroy his life to become disciplined. He simplified it. He removed unnecessary choices. He decided in advance what he would do, and then he followed through. And something unexpected happened. He felt free, not restricted, because discipline removes chaos. It removes indecision. It removes the mental weight of constantly choosing between comfort and effort. Now think about that. Most people believe discipline is restrictive, but in reality, it is the thing that gives you control. Now ask yourself this. Where in your life are you hiding behind the idea of balance? Where are you giving yourself permission to stay the same? Because this is where the real shift happens. Not when you feel ready, not when it feels right, but when you decide that negotiation is no longer an option. And once you reach that point, you stop drifting. You start moving with intention. And in the final part, everything comes together. Not as a system, not as a plan, but as a declaration of who you are from this point forward. There is a version of you that you keep postponing, not because you don't want it, but because becoming that version requires something you've been avoiding for a long time: absolute honesty with yourself. Not the kind of honesty where you admit you need to improve. That's easy, that's comfortable. The real kind is when you stop hiding behind your own excuses, when you stop softening the truth, when you look directly at your patterns and say, this is why my life looks the way it does. Because here is the reality most people will never say out loud. You are not stuck. You are not unlucky. You are not waiting for the right moment. You are repeating what is comfortable. And comfort, repeated long enough, becomes your identity. Now take a moment and look back at the past 7 days, not emotionally, not with judgment. Just observe. How many times did you hesitate when you knew exactly what to do? How many times did you delay something small that later became something heavy? How many times did you choose what felt good in the moment instead of what would move you forward? Because those moments, they are not random. They are the blueprint of your life. And if nothing changes, they will repeat again and again and again, until one day you look back and realize that years have passed, but you are still standing in the same place. Now here is where everything shifts, because becoming unstoppable is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming someone who no longer breaks under their own patterns, someone who sees the impulse to quit and doesn't follow it. Someone who feels resistance and moves anyway. Someone who makes a decision and treats it as final. This is not dramatic. It is not visible, but it is powerful. Because the moment you stop negotiating with weakness, you start building a version of yourself that your past self would not even recognize. Now let's bring everything together. You act immediately, before hesitation grows. You build identity through small, undeniable proof. You move regardless of how you feel. You shape your environment so it works for you, not against you. You keep one promise until trust is rebuilt. You remove negotiation disguised as balance. These are not just habits. They are filters. And once they are in place, your life begins to change automatically. Not because you are forcing it, but because the version of you making decisions is no longer the same. Now understand this clearly. 7 days will not make you perfect. 7 days will not solve everything. But 7 days can prove something far more important. That you are capable of change. That you are capable of control. That you are capable of becoming someone who follows through. And once you have that proof, you don't go back. Because the hardest part of transformation is not the effort. It is the belief. And after 7 days of real discipline, you no longer need to believe. You know. So from this point forward, there is no more waiting. No more overthinking. No more preparing. There is only one question left. What is the next action you said you would take? And the version of you that is becoming unstoppable already knows the answer. And more importantly, they are already moving